So at this point, I think the last major mechanical component we need to make the gameplay complete is the game over state. So I think hand in hand with the game over state is a paused state before the game actually begins. That way we can have the player start at a title screen and press like enter or spacebar or the start button to begin play. And then we can like transition back to that paused state when the player gets a game over. We want to have a state before the gameplay is running, and then a way to make it run and a way to make it stop running. So we'll go ahead. I think we should make a title screen now, and then when we have a title screen, it shouldn't be too much effort to make a game over state and then have it like transition back to the title screen, or it'll be very similar to the title screen. Pausing and starting all of the gameplay will be similar in the title screen and the game over state. We could make a separate widget blueprint for the title screen elements, but I think I'll go ahead and just add them to the UI HUD widget blueprint, and I don't think it's going to get too busy, so just a few more elements, text elements for the title and like the text saying press enter to begin. I'm going to try out something that I've never actually used before, which is this background blur effect. So we can just add that to our canvas panel and use this anchor here, which then will make it fit the extents of the screen. As long as we set all the offsets to 0, then it's just going to fill the whole panel. And then when I'll just set everything to vertically aligned, even though it shouldn't really matter. We can set this parameter here and it will make it blurrier. So it quickly gets so blurry that it might as well not be there. That's really too blurry though, so I don't know what's good, but I'm gonna try like 5, maybe like 7, so that you don't have to try to read it, but it's not so blurry that you can't tell what it's supposed to be. We'll try that, I guess. What I want to have happen is this blur just makes everything fade into the background, and then we have the title text on top of it. So if we add a text parameter now, I think everything underneath it in the hierarchy is not going to be blurred, but if we move this above the blur object, now it's blurred, see? So I think as long as we keep it underneath the blur object, then it's going to not be blurred. So I'm going to now put this in the center of the panel with no offsets and centered alignment and size to content. I'll go ahead and make this 96, should be good. I'm not going to come up with a title for this project, so you're welcome to come up with one. I'm just going to call it Puzzle Game Title. I don't want to come up with a catchy title for a game that's just a replica of another game, so I'm just going to leave it up to you. And I'm going to put an outline just because it gives it a tiny bit of extra little visual flair, but it can't be black. That won't be super noticeable. Well, it might be noticeable against the grid background, but I'm going to make it just a little bit gray so it maybe pops a tiny bit more, and then maybe I'll make the title, maybe I'll make it orange so it fits the orange and gray color scheme that we have going, but maybe a little lighter. One other thing I did was I got a Google font. If you want to make these fonts not just the default font that comes with Unreal, I'd recommend downloading some fonts from somewhere that are free to use, so you can go ahead and use Google Fonts if you want. There's quite a few interesting fonts to select from, so I downloaded one called Russo 1, and it's a little bit more blocky, so maybe it's a little more fitting for the game type, but it's a bit subjective and I'm not a graphic designer, so I think it looks alright. So now I'm going to add one more text object, and I'll put it relative to the center. Maybe like 400. Nope, that's too much. 300. And again, I'll set the alignment to the center. Justify the text in the center. And I'll just write here, press enter to begin. So I know when we started this series, I said I would use the game controller to test out the gameplay, but it's just been so much easier to use the keyboard and mouse that I'm just testing everything with the keyboard at this point. I'm going to go ahead and add an input action for like a start, pause, maybe is what I'll call it, and that will be what begins the game, and then they can press it again in mid-game to pause the gameplay and resume the gameplay. So that's the button they'll have to press here to begin the game. So I'll make it enter, and it would also be like the plus the the play button or the start button on a game controller. I'll make this a little bigger, like 36 perhaps. And that looks about okay. So if I just see what this looks like now, everything's going to be blurred except for the text here. And it looks a little bit cool, but we don't actually want the gameplay to begin playing behind them. Or, maybe we do. Maybe we want it to just look like this, and then when they press enter, it will actually reset the gameplay from scratch. But I think for now I'm going to just make the game not play. So to do that, we're going to have to add some events into our logic so that the game doesn't actually start playing until they press a button. So first let's go ahead and add the input action. So I go to project settings and then the input tab here. We'll add one more action mapping. I'm going to call it start pause. It's not the best title in the world, but hopefully it gets the point across. So the enter key, and it could also be the right. Let's see, what would they call it here? Special right, maybe? I believe that's corresponds to like the start button, which is called like the options button on the PS4 controller now, and it's called maybe like play or something on the Xbox controller, I don't know, but it's typically where the start button would be in the center of the controller, in the right hand side of the center. So now we'll test it out with the enter key, but first we need to have it do something. So when the player controller receives the start pause action, for now we're just going to have it begin the game. So we'll have a event in the game mode that actually begins all the gameplay here. I'm just going to close all these other tabs real quick. It's getting ridiculous. And I'll scoot this over so it's not looking like that anymore. So we want to break down all of this functionality, or most of this functionality, into something, a new function, so that it doesn't actually begin on begin play. So we want a title that's similar to begin play, but something that makes it distinct from that. So I'm going to call this start the game. So it's like begin play, but not. And I think I could basically put all of this here, but we do want the UI to be created and added to the screen, so everything but that will be added to the start the game function. Oh, I've missed something here. I didn't grab the actual nodes inside of this comment box. even some of this could be broken off into separate functions like spawn in grid and timer bar, but I think it's simple enough to keep it all in one function like this. So now, if we remove this from the begin play function, and when the player presses start, we can achieve the desired functionality by using a do once node, which will make sure that the action here only happens once unless we reset this node. But if we have a do once and then here we do the game modes start the game function, this will prevent the actual spawning in of every object multiple times if the player presses the start button multiple times. That's not what we want to have happen, so this is a simple way to prevent it, but we can also prevent it by using our own booleans and our own custom logic so that we can make the start button do different things later on. But just to initially test it, I'm going to use a do once node here. So now it's initially, there's nothing on screen except some HUD elements, which we could hide those and have them appear along with the start game, but then there'd be nothing like interesting in the title screen. So I might in fact even spawn in the grid, but nothing else. So also I need to remove the title and the blur when the player presses start. So I think to have the grid there might give it a little bit more interesting visual effects. Also, let's see what the errors are right now. Many errors. My goodness. So we need to be careful that all the other objects in the game don't have begin play events that rely on things that haven't been created yet. So when we made the game mode delay some of its setup into another function, the player controller is calling this event from begin play. So the player controller is going to exist and start trying to do this logic before the game mode has set up all of its variables. So we need to have the start the game function do this instead of the begin play event inside of the player controller. So when the game mode start the game function occurs, after all this is set up, we actually need to do one more thing, which is call this logic here, and any other begin plays elsewhere in other blueprints we need to start manually here instead of automatically. So we can go ahead and make a function here inside player controller called start the game, or an event maybe. So I'll just do a custom event here and just say start the game, which perhaps could be called start the game underscore, player controller, but whatever you want to call it, to just replace the begin play. This could be a function too, but I'm just going to leave it at the top here so that it's clear what I was doing for me to reference later. Hopefully that makes sense. So I could do a sequence here, but for now just one little band-aid I'm just going to do here. The game mode doesn't actually have access to the player controller, so it does have access to it, but it doesn't have a reference to it right now. So I need to cast this to our player controller type to get its events and functions. And now hopefully all those errors should go away, but there might be other ones that I haven't accounted for yet. But now the player controller isn't trying to move objects that haven't been spawned in yet. And now when I press enter here, they should spawn in, and when we quit the play there's no errors, so that's good. So now in the HUD we want to remove these elements or hide them after the player presses enter. So we have to make these into variables so that we can change them at runtime. So just turn all three of these into variables, and I'll rename them too so that they're self-descriptive. I'll call this just title text, And I'll call this one title instruction text. Blur. No, that's not very good. Let's call it, we'll call the background blur title blur, so that they'll have prefixed title. We could group these together or put them all in a box or some other parent object, but I think it's fine to have them just all share the title prefix. So when the player presses the start button, we will start the game, and this will include... This is the point where I need to start breaking this up into a sequence so that it doesn't get ridiculous. So I'm going to move this start the game here to another pin in the sequence. So this 0th element of the sequence is going to be all the begin play stuff that the game mode was handling. So in fact, I'm going to shrink this into another function and call it start the game underscore game mode. That way it sort of implies that it's all the logic relating to starting the game that the game mode is handling. That way we can also call start the game player controller, and it maybe is a little more clear what we're doing here. We have one object with the start the game function, but then it calls all the start the game sub functions on the different objects. So on the HUD we're going to have a function called start the game HUD. So I'll make a new function here. Start the game HUD. Perhaps instead of underscores we should do something like a dash, so that it implies that it's visible here. That is like something separating it from the words start the game. So I'm going to go ahead and do that on my other two events and functions. So start the game dash game mode, and then here we're going to start the game dash player controller. And that just looks terrible in the event. So remove the underscores. There we go. So now we have on the game mode we have start the game game mode, start the game player controller, and now we'll have start the game HUD as well. So that means we need to save a reference to the UI HUD when we spawn it in. So here, instead of just adding it directly to the viewport, we need a reference to it as well. So UI HUD reference. Set that here when we create the object. And now when we start the game, we call on the HUD, we call start the game HUD. And now when that function gets called on the HUD, we're going to make some animations using these three objects. And then we just, in the graphs, we tell those animations to run. And then over time they'll run the animation, which is just some keyframes on the different parameters. So we can, use the opacity as a parameter in an animation and have it go from 1 to 0 over time. And then when we play the animation, it'll just fade out. So we don't have to worry about fading it out manually in blueprints with an event, with a timeline, or using delta time or anything like that. We can do it all automatically with an animation. And all this is going to do is play our animations. So it might in fact be one animation. We'll make a new animation, call it TitleScreen Fade Out. And it's going to incorporate the 3 elements of our title screen. So select it here, and then add a new track for the title blur. And we're going to set its opacity from 1 to 0 over the course of 1 second. So now you see that the blur effect, if we preview the animation by going through it like this, the blur will fade out over the course of 1 second. That might even be too fast, but we'll see. We can make it 2 seconds if we need to. So now I'm going to add another track using the title text object and the title instruction text object. Do the same thing, opacity from 1 at 0 seconds to 0 at 1 second. And one more time, do the same thing for the title instruction text. Add a render opacity track. Now this needs to be 0 at 1 second and 1 at 0 seconds. I put 9 instead of 0 here. So now when that plays, they'll fade out as the opacity, as the Gaussian blur fades out. So now all we need to do is run that animation when the player presses the start button. So here we get a reference to that animation by just, I think we just type here title screen fade out. And this is the animation reference. And then we just say play animation. And here we can modify the playback speed if we want to without messing up the animation by just changing this value here. So we'll just add a return node. And we can see what that looks like now if we press enter here. It'll fade out, but I might slow that down a little bit and delay the other things until that completes so that it's not confusing, because what's happening is the gameplay is starting before the fade out has started, so that's a little bit confusing. So I'll probably slow this down a little bit, and also we need this to play out first, and when it's completed then we want to run the other events in our sequence. So there's probably a couple ways to do that, but I can just add a timer or something inside the game mode. We want the title screen fade out animation to complete before gameplay begins. So I'm actually going to move this to element 0 and then move this down and move this down. And instead of a sequence here, well, I mean, I will have a sequence, but we can instead do a timer. In fact, we'll need to separate this out into separate functions. So after we run this part, we'll set timer by function name. This will take about 2 seconds to finish up, so I'll just put 2 seconds here. And I'll go ahead and rename this function. Instead of start the game, I'm going to call this begin title screen fade out. And then I'll have another function called start the game. And this will contain this logic here in a sequence. Because this is actual gameplay logic, because the other thing is just a cosmetic animation that has no bearing on the actual gameplay logic. So this will go and start the game. And this is only in the game mode because it is going to run game mode functions here, right? Start the game is going to run in the game mode, but it's using the HUD is mainly what this function entails, but also begins this timer. And this comment here is explaining why we have this timer. So the player presses start or enter, and then this function runs, right? Begin title screen fade out. And then that starts the actual game logic with a delay of 2 seconds. We shouldn't hard code this, we should find a way to parameterize it, but for now I'm just going to leave it at 2 seconds. But now we should get the behavior I wanted where the animation, this will fade away and then the gameplay will begin. But I still do want the grid in the background, I didn't add that yet. So here we want the grid to spawn in here too. So instead of putting it in start the game mode, we can spawn the grid in by itself and then feed the reference here when we need to. So this logic is just going to get removed from this function and put in the event graph begin play. Now the grid will be there in the background of the title screen. So things will be a little less jarring when the gameplay begins after the title screen fades out. Now there is something that's been bugging me for a while here. It's I talked about it earlier, it's this line right here. It appears thinner than the lines on either side of it. And same with this line right here. It's thinner, this horizontal line. The grid line here is like thinner than the other ones. My hypothesis right now is that is because the camera is like exactly centered on this part of the screen. And so for some reason that causes this weird visual effect. So perhaps if I move the camera just a slight amount to like the right or left, maybe that'll go away, but if not, I don't know. It looks like now the effect has just been transferred to this row instead. If you look now, this vertical line is now thinner than the rest. But it's still the same horizontal line. And now I'm getting a bunch of errors. Oh, that's what happened. I'm pressing buttons besides enter before the gameplay has started. So I need to make sure that can't happen by just using a Boolean. I'll fix that in one moment, but for now I'm going to try something, an even smaller offset than this. Let's try something like 0.1. I found that if I do 800.1 instead of 800 as it was before, and 741.1 instead of 740 like it was before, it seems to have removed any noticeable weird visual effects on the grid line rows and columns here. They seem to be all the same width now. So that visual quirk has been resolved, and I don't think it's moved the grid noticeably off center or anything, so I think it's fine. And now we have the title screen fading in and out. We just need to resolve the problem of breaking all the logic if the player presses anything but enter first. So I think I can make just one small change to the player controller blueprint, and that will account for not allowing the player to input any commands except for the enter instead of the start pause command until the game begins. So all I need to do is modify this so that we only allow the player to use the move down command if the quad is not dropping faster, just like these other commands here. So I can just add another branch to here like this, just like the other ones. And if this is true, now it's the opposite of this because we're not using the not. We aren't using the not node here, so this is actually the opposite. When this is true, we want the slower time here. So that could be a little confusing, but now we need to set is quad dropping faster to be initially true, and it's going to sort of pull double duty as a unofficial pause button. So when this is set to true, none of the player's input commands are going to do anything. So that way we can set it to be initially true and then set it to false again when the gameplay begins. So just set this to be initially true, and then we need to make sure that when we do start game mode, at the end here we set it to false again. And I'll make a little quick note here saying allow player input. Now I believe this will prevent the player from being able to do anything here except for press enter. So if I press spacebar, down, left, right, any of the buttons, nothing's happening. But if I press enter, then now once the game begins, the player can press everything as normal. So that's a way of getting around having to worry about using the built-in pause mode. We've made our own pause by just disallowing any inputs and not running the game logic until the game begins.